Dear Americans, can you explain the 2 weeks notice system to a fellow European? I don't get it. I've read a lot of posts in this sub and oftentimes it is talked about giving 2 weeks notice when resigning from a job. I am from Germany and here we have legal requirements when we want to quit a job. Especially notice periods are important to watch out, as our employee could potentially sue you if you don't follow the required periods. However, on the other side, employers have strict rules when they want to fire people, which also includes long periods, standard being a 3 months period. Edit. German law requires at least 1 month. Periods get longer for employers when employees have worked a certain amount of years for them. So I've googled your 2 weeks notice system and basically found out it's not a legal requirement, but it is seen courteous. Well, what's the point then? Corporations milking people, paying low wages, lying in job descriptions, bosses being dickheads and so on. But it is necessary to give 2 weeks notice to be courteous? Well, from a legal perspective it is not mandatory. Why would someone then follow this rule? You don't seem to win anything by following it, actually doing the employer another favor. I don't get it. Most of the time it's one of two things. You either want a good recommendation from the company or because it is ingrained into you. That's it, nothing else. Adding to this, it's also to not burn bridges. You never know if going back to that company in the future would be a good move. Also, they might badmouth you to their friends who own businesses and they'd not hire you. Basically, it's to, as much as you can, cover your own butt. I don't generally give notice for the company. I give notice so my colleagues aren't completely fricked when I leave. I use the last 2 weeks to create documentation and update the status of projects so the people I work with, whom I generally like, aren't hose being down a person and not having a clue about the state of any active projects. I gave my last job 4 weeks notice, partly for this reason, and 2 selfish ones. Part of my reason for leaving was my boss had zero leadership ability. With 4 weeks notice, Mr. Leader in title only took 3.5 weeks to start reassigning my work. Villa surprise. It's sold under 2 primary points. 1. If you want a good reference. 2. If you want to be rehirable. From my understanding, our state laws vary a lot on the first and primary reason people do, which is references. In mine they can only legally say your dates of employment there. Lots of employers break this rule, but good luck finding out. I quit on the spot one time and my manager said I was immature, seeing as how the work environment was extremely toxic and the whole staff had to basically walk on eggshells whenever we clocked in. I felt like it was valid. If you like the people, the place, or you're just a professional, job reference for your next employer, you may have the intentions on giving your current employer a 2-week notice. That's the answer. It really boils down to how much I respect the workplace and management. If they are decent, I'll give them 2 weeks to give them time to find a replacement or figure out a plan to replace me. If they are the worst, I just quit showing up and might call them. Reap what you sow. I don't need a recommendation or good word from a management staff I don't respect or trust. As I understand, most, if not all, EU countries have some sort of law requiring both employers and employees to provide advance notice either when quitting or being fired. This protects both the employer and the employee, and I see it as a fair balance that protects both sides. The US has no such law. Many states are what are called at will states, which essentially means you can quit or be fired at any time, with no notice, for almost any reason. As a result, it became customary, although not required, for employees to give 2 weeks notice when quitting. Unfortunately, this same courtesy is often not reciprocated and many companies will fire people with zero notice. You got it right. It's not a system. Managers and bosses just act like they're entitled to it and have created a false standard when in the end it's just a courtesy. But no, it's not mandatory at all. The problem is, there's a universally heavily implied threat that if you don't do it, your former employers can ruin your career and future. Legally, they're not entirely allowed to do that. A lot of the employer-employee relationship standards in America are based on fear. You have to do blah 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 or I'll put a mark in your record. Blackball you from the industry. Call your future employers and tell them horror stories I've just made up blah blah blah. In a lot of situations, the 2-week notice helps your coworkers more than your employer. In any type of customer service role, where the absence of one person creates more work for everyone around them, it can really help coworkers more. That is, restaurants, retail, etc. This exactly. The company will be fine. The people I work with will be doubly hosed down a person and without any idea of where projects are at, what needs to be done on the daily, etc. I have usually really liked my colleagues. I don't want to make their lives any harder. Last 2 weeks is spent getting them in a good place, not actually doing the job anymore. It's expected that employees offer the employer 2 weeks in order to allow them time to hire a replacement. Does not apply in reverse. Which is why I don't give notice. In America it also depends on if you're under a contract, like in teaching. Teachers often have to get approval to break contract or could risk losing their license if the district decides to go after it at the state level. They don't lose it, but they can't use it in any other district. Traditionally, Americans gave 2 weeks notice to allow employers to have someone trained to cover until a replacement could be hired. In return, employers were expected to also give notice or 2 weeks severance in lieu of notice. Sometime in the 1980s, employers eliminated that customary severance pay that allowed employees to cover bills until a new job could be obtained or an unemployment insurance claim processed. Because Americans can legally be fired without warning and traditional courtesies are in abeyance, many are now quitting without notice. Two-way street. Can't expect to receive if you don't give. Employers need to understand that people are getting sick of being treated like cattle for the owner's benefit and nothing else. Yes, it's an etiquette thing. Something ingrained in our culture. It helps your employer find your replacement and supposedly reflects well on your resume. However, many people are finding out it's a bunch of BS and aren't feeling bound by this rule because they know they are undervalued and underpaid. The tide is changing and it's about time. It's usually a courtesy to give 2 weeks notice as time to transition work to other employees. Some contracts also require it to pay out vacation time if owed. Also leaving the company on a good note in case you want a recommendation or possibly return in the future. With that said, employees don't have to give 2 weeks notice as long as they are fine with the consequences. I've seen plenty of people quit jobs same day and simply walk out of the building. I have a question for you, OP. My understanding from what you wrote is that if a person is fired, the employer has to give 3 months notice? That seems ludicrous. I once worked with a girl that posted info about patients with names on her Facebook and was fired for it due to gross violation of patient privacy laws, which I'm sure Deutschland has too. The employee was a danger to the hospital because patients could sue and she was blatantly violating HIPAA, America's patient privacy law. If she spent another 3 months at the hospital, she could have done so much damage. Also, if someone is given 3 months in any occupation, that gives them a long time to sabotage the business. What's to stop a disgruntled fired employee from ruining their employer? What if the employee assaulted someone at the business? Do the other employees have to deal with that person for 3 months while they wait for the firing process to end? Please explain. I'm so curious. I have never worked through a 2-week notice. I usually give one and leave as soon as something comes up. Not sorry at all. Companies will drop you in a heartbeat and not think twice about it. I just show them the same courtesy as all. It's supposed to be a professional courtesy given to employers which isn't reciprocated to employees. Many states have at-will employment laws, which means either party can terminate the relationship without cause or reason. The latter is used by employers while the former is expected of employees. It was a custom that began back when people had somewhat better relationships with employers and was done as a courtesy. Now, I think people mostly do it because they are afraid an employer will give them a bad reference and cost them a future job. But since there's little stopping them from doing that anyway, I tell people all the time, if you are leaving an employer because they treated you like crap, don't give notice. You can't count on them for a reference anyway, because they were crappy, or you wouldn't be quitting. And since they owe you nothing, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. It's a conditioned response. Someone somewhere at some point said it was a thing and here we are. We're told to believe that if we don't do it then we'll never get hired anywhere ever again. The thing is, why isn't there a level playing field where I get to say that place sucked? That's why I left. Why is it always the employee that has to bow down to the way things have always been? It's nonsense and I hope it changes fast. My mind is blown that in some countries the employer have to give notice. American workers are so fricked. It's embarrassing. I'd only do the notice because I'd want to use my employer as a reference for my next job. It's something employers have gaslit the entire country into believing exists. I have never ever given my 2 weeks. If I am ready to leave, I'll dang well do it. It exists with the sole purpose of letting the employer have 2 weeks to get their crap together, even if they are the sole reason you are leaving. Some establishments are scummy enough to make you agree to those terms in writing via your contract. One could argue you are too European to understand. That and tipping. FK American employers are cheap. Another side of giving 2 weeks is money itself. If you quit the day you are giving the new job, in America, the company could require you to take a drug test, which could take up to a week itself to get back. Plus, you must also complete I-9 verification documentation for tax purposes and any new hire paperwork required for the job, which can be delayed for any number of reasons. So with number 2 weeks notice, you have no pay buffer because you've quit your job immediately and cannot start your new job until you're cleared to work your new one based on their requirements. I give 2 weeks notice because I think it's fair to do, unless there's something completely unforgivable happening or I am required to start my new job early. I've given a 1 week notice when I really couldn't afford to continue making the money I did at the old job and felt like they had been unfair to me. I no-showed 3 days in a row, so they would just assume I quit without me giving a resignation when I was being sexually harassed by a coworker, and the company wouldn't do anything to intervene. But usually I give 2 weeks notice. It's definitely a courtesy, and companies never give you a 2-week notice before terminating an employee, so I'm not sure why I bother, but my family are small business owners, so I was raised that it is the right thing to do. What's worse about the 2 weeks resignation standard is that there's a general requirement that it has to be in physical writing as well. So while you may have let your employer know, deuces, I'm out, this be verbally, it won't constitute an actual agreement to them. While they're fine not documenting most agreements that are beneficial to the employee that are done verbally, and will try to say to those agreements never happened. Document everything, peeps. So in effect, people are scheduled past their 2 weeks notice unless they have formal documentation that isn't even legally required. Company I work for won't pay out what they matched for your 401k if you don't give proper 2 weeks notice. They also won't pay out whatever vacation time you have left without you fighting for it. That's pretty much the only leverage they have for it. Most large companies will only verify dates of employment for references now, so it isn't even worth it for a good versus bad reference anymore. People often follow this rule because we're not barbarians. Most customs are not legal requirements. If I hold a door for someone, it's not because I'm following a law. If I give a 4-week notice, I get my unused PTO, paid time off, paid to me at 75% of my base. I have 350 some hours right now and growing, so it'll be a big check when I leave. I once gave a 2 months notice to a job I loved that treated me respectfully and kindly. It wasn't at all necessary, but I knew I was having to move soon and didn't want to leave them stranded, as I was finishing up a huge project and my 2 other co-workers in my department worked substantially less hours, so I would have left a gaping hole in my wake without the warning. I worked there in total for about 6 months. When I left, my boss cried and gave me a big hug. We had the actual family-like structure a lot of toxic workplaces like to abuse. I miss them terribly. In contrast, I walked out at the end of the day on a Friday after handing my boss a curt "today is my last day" notice. That place was a nightmare in every sense, so they did not deserve 2 weeks of my time after all the abuse. I worked there almost 3 years. In short, a notice period is a courtesy bestowed upon employers that deserve it, or you are contractually obliged to give it. We all know by now that the USA is all about business, and this is another example of that. I live in the South, where every state is at war when it comes to employment. This means that if your employer wants to fire you, they do not have a legitimate reason to do so. I remember all the older PPL saying that you give a 2 weeks notice because you don't want to burn bridges you might have to cross again. In my head I was thinking, if I'm quitting, why would I go back? I never grew up. It's the toxic guilt that a lot of Americans feel. We're conditioned to think we don't deserve better for ourselves, and that our employers are doing us a favor by hiring us. So when we leave a job, many feel obligated to the employer because they feel like they're doing something wrong. The 2-week notice is BS in situations where the employer is mailing the employer. In an industry where there is a lot of collaboration between companies, sometimes you don't want to burn the bridge. Most of the time though, the company wouldn't give us notice to fire us, and there's nothing we can do about that. And no one usually bats an eye if that happens. But if an employee leaves without giving notice, it's viewed as selfish and leaving the company in a bad spot. My employer got mad that an employee left without notice. This girl was on maternity leave and decided not to come back. She was out for 3 months already. He asked me what I thought and my response was she hasn't been here for 3 months. We'd have to train her on everything anyway. Needless to say, he didn't like my response. TLDR. Americans have a sense of obligation to employers and we're trained that we have to give notice. It's BS. Generally it is a practice that when someone quits they inform their bosses and make their last day 2 weeks out to give the company time to find and train someone for the open position. That said, it is a courtesy, not a requirement. That's something employers tend to forget, especially if one lives in an equal state. If I'm working for an employer who fires people on the spot with no notice, then I will quit without notice. Courtesy is a two-way street. Just want to mention that yes, it's just an etiquette thing that benefits only the current employer because they're supposed to train your replacement during that time. However, in right to work states, which means you obviously don't have a right to work, it's just opposite land union busting BS. Your employer can fire you because they don't like your hair color and you don't have to give any notice of leaving. However, businesses seem to forget that they reap what they sow and they can have people quit immediately with no chance of having anyone to replace you. Then they go to their congresspeople and cry more about what they caused themselves. I'm submitting my 2 weeks notice tomorrow. I'm not leaving on bad terms. I just found a better opportunity that advances my career to the next level. By submitting a 2 weeks notice, I'm allowing for a smoother transition and knowledge transfer on my projects to the co-workers who will be taking them over. There is no real tangible benefit to myself if everything works as expected. However, if the new position doesn't work out, then I haven't burned any bridges and could potentially resume my original position. Canadian here. Our employment laws are a bit better than the US, but not for a lack of big business trying to make it worse. In Canada, it's illegal for an employer to make an employee give or work their 2 weeks notice. It is a courtesy. Normally it's done in small industries to maintain a good reputation. On the flip side, this is mostly for full-time salaried employment, which is the most protection. I'm not familiar with union rules so won't comment. If you give your 2 weeks notice, the employer asks you not to come into work anymore, but they still have to pay you for the 2 weeks. You can't get fired for no reason. They need to make a reason or be downsizing, restructuring to make it a reason, and then they pay you more severance. Unless you're in the 3-month probation period, the employer need to pay you severance based upon the length of employment. 1 year equals 2 weeks and then per every year it grows. This differs by provinces so it can vary. We also have paid maternity leave of up 1/2, but it's reduced pay and you have a guaranteed job when you come back. And it is illegal for you to be fired during leave. For part-time, non-salaried workers the rules are different. Some industries have their own set of rules, i.e. constitution workers get EI during the winter because they can't work. There is still maternity leave, parental leave that you can claim, 15 weeks, via EI. We also have universal healthcare, which really takes the pressure off workers as you don't need to have a job to go to the doctor or get healthcare. Canada is nearly as bad, but the racism is directed against a smaller group, natives, and political power is concentrated in the provinces, especially Quebec, which is its own country in all but name. So what would be an oppressed minority, the francophone Québécois, end up running their own show and taking PM office half the time. All the good prime ministers except one, Pearson, were from Quebec. The 2 week notice thing applies in Canada too, but it is more of a formality. No one actually works that 2 weeks. It ends up being paid vacation. Though if you are asked to document something for your successor in that time, you should. I would consider it reasonable to go to a job site to record status of work and next steps left to do, in exchange for a solid reference. People quit jobs for all sorts of reasons. Over the next few years it will be poor management sending emails that say you have to come back to work to people who are more productive from home, know it, and can work for anyone else on earth, all of whom know they are already doing work. Until all those managers are fired, there will be no labor stability in certain fields. Software, design, marketing. But just because someone doesn't realize they kill companies with those emails, forcing literally everyone to quit if even one person gets one, doesn't mean that companies' innocent executives will hate you. Sending that email is the new sexual harassment, but the older managers don't understand the office is dead and never returning. It's the name of a sitcom describing a type of slavery that ended with the pandemic. Forever. So at this point in history most resignations are simply because of that disconnect, and documenting neatly what needs to be done just shows you live in this century. It will act as proof to any future employer also that you behaved reasonably even when employer didn't. Where did the practice of a 40-hour work week come from? Time and a half or more for overtime or holiday pay? Any sick leave? These are all innovations prompted in the USA by the unionization movement from the first half of the 1900s. Largely adopted by government as employer as well. Spread to private sector. Many states are employment at will. I'm free to work for you. You're free to fire me for any reason not prohibited by law. Think discrimination. Some states have more protections than others. It's not a system, just customary. In theory, it's a way to leave on good terms by giving your employer an opportunity to find a replacement and maybe even overlap a bit so you can help train them. I've given 2 weeks to most places, stayed an extra week for employers I liked, left on the spot from employers I hated. It's not a law or anything, and I don't know of any employer who's ever asked about it in employment verification. It depends if you want to burn bridges or not. Sometimes connections can still be useful. It really depends on the industry, job, and why you're leaving. For me personally, it's been ingrained in by my boomer parents that it's respectful and you don't want to burn bridges because you never know who you'll run into down the road, which is technically true I guess. I've always done it, even for my first crappy retail job. They were actually surprised I even let them know I was quitting LOL. The 2 weeks notice is a courtesy. It's not mandatory at all. My last job, my boss was awesome and whatnot, but I found a better job and gave him a 2 weeks notice out of respect and courtesy just for being awesome and being a great person. In doing so, since I'm welcomed back at my last job, so I'll never be without a job if something happens to current one. Right now I'm on probation with my new job since it's unionized and that's what they said. I got lucky since mine is only 6 months and they bumped it up to 12 months now. It is a courtesy given to ensure a positive future relationship with the employer, either to get a reference recommendation or to possibly return to the company. Alternatively, I gave 2 weeks notice because I was mid-project as a kindness to my coworkers, not my employer. I was the only one experienced in a several-month project that we had a hard deadline on. It's the socially acceptable notice period when quitting. This sub doesn't like to recognize it, but if you live in a small town, work in a small industry, or will ever need a favor from your co-workers or boss in the future, quitting with 2 weeks notice won't be seen as ashlery. I gave 2 months notice once, used my old boss as a reference for lots of other jobs and going back to school. We live in the same town and still run into each other. Legally I could have quit on the spot, but I wanted to maintain the relationship. 2 weeks is the bare minimum to not burn the bridge. In the US we have what is called employment at will. This means that the employer can terminate a worker at any time for any reason. A good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. Most workers in the US do not have contracts. There are exceptions for government positions, academia and unions. We are free to resign at any time. It was customary to provide a 2-week notice to allow the employer to find a replacement for you. Many people believe this is a requirement, but it's really only a courtesy. Depends on the job company. I typically give and work a 2 weeks notice to remain in good standing with the company should I ever wish to apply for another position there or at another branch later on in the future. If you're on good terms with the company and there is a chance that you potentially return to the company in the future, it's good practice to give a 2 weeks notice so you don't burn bridges. Based on my past experiences, I've actually enjoyed the last 2 weeks of work as no one really expects you to do anything those last 2 weeks except tie loose ends and hand off your work to someone else, so it's an easy way to just collect money and hang out. There will be feedback here that you shouldn't give a notice, and if the company has been taken advantage of you, I agree, but if it's generally decent and takes care of its people, then give the notice. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.